Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to Gender and Society. This is lecture number 16 on gender and globalization, and we are also going to look at a part of theory from international relations as it intersects with the idea of gender in globalization. So, the two key questions or aspects that we will consider here is first an understanding of what is globalization, how do we understand globalization using the sociological lens, and how does globalization affect gender. And in this part we are also going to look at a part of IR theory or theories from international relations, which is related to an understanding of gender at the global scale in terms of globalization. So, to start with, how do we understand globalization theory? What are the indicators or what are the elements of globalization theory? And we see that it is a theory that examines the emergence of a global cultural system that is brought about by a variety of social and cultural developments. So, as you can see, we are talking here about a global system, and this system is informed by, is constructed by, is influenced by a set of social and cultural developments. And we see the trends of these cultural or social developments either at the local level or at the regional level or at the national or international levels. And these impacts therefore bring about a system of organization that is encapsulated in an understanding of globalization theory. So, another point of clarification in this regard is that globalization is not really a very new phenomenon, and it, as a social process, globalization is old and it has a much longer history than is talked about. So the idea of globalization has started decades ago, and many writers and scholars, they have traced the early globalization processes to the dissemination of religion, to the dissemination of culture, the interactions of people, groups, communities through trade, commerce since ancient times. So, mobility, human mobility has been a constant factor since the growth of civilizations. And history doesn't really give us a point of time where we do not see the existence of mobility. We have always seen that human beings have been mobile, they have been interacting with each other, they have been engaging in an exchange process through culture, in terms of economics, in terms of social understanding. So we see that process, we see that growth of a shared understanding since very long in the history of globalization. So it is not really a very new phenomenon. That is one of the starting points to understand globalization. So then the question is globalization an economic phenomena? Is it a social phenomena? Or is it a cultural phenomena? So how do we define it in this context, and how do we understand it? So we see the movement towards the expansion of economic and social ties between countries through the spread of corporate institutions and the capitalist philosophy that leads to the shrinking of the world in economic terms, offers us an economic lens to understand globalization. So we see, the world is becoming a smaller place, and the spread of corporate institutions, the spread of capitalism, the spread of social and economic ties between countries, that actually brings about a movement in current times, which is understood as the process of globalization. So at the sociological level, then the understanding focuses on an analysis on the flows and processes in society, whether at the local, national or global levels. As I just said, that if we use a sociological angle in this regard, we examine these flows, these processes, in terms of the various levels of the local, the regional, the national or the global level. So one of the starting points is to understand that globalization is not really a new phenomenon. It has had a very, very long history, but one of the ways for us to understand globalization in the current context is whether we would use an economic lens, where we talk about these economic ties between countries and corporate institutions, or we look at the sociological lens of analyzing globalization as a flow and process of these practices at the various levels. So in terms of defining globalization, we do not really come across a universal definition of globalization, given the fact that it has traveled such a long history, and there are so many different ways to approach the understanding of globalization, that there is no universal definition, no one definition to understand globalization. Oftentimes, what is used is the economic definition of globalization, which includes trade, finance and communications. And then we see that there's a broader definition of globalization, and this is what Thomas Friedman calls an international system that replaced the Cold War. And in his book, The World is Flat, Friedman actually talks about the 10 flatteners that actually made the world flat. And if you haven't read the book, I would highly encourage that you give it a read, that to understand what happened in the last 20-30 years or so that has made the world flat, as Friedman calls. So that brings a broader understanding of how we understand globalization. So again, there are two ways in which in this respect we can understand, or we can approach in understanding globalization. The first one is globalization as fact, that the spread and connectedness of production, communication and technologies across the world. So it's the tangible reality, it is a fact that we do see the spread of connectedness of production, communication, technology, and this is what in a way giving us an understanding of globalization as a fact. The other idea here is globalization as an ideology, as a policy. And this is referring to the efforts by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank and others to create a global free market for goods and services. So we see globalization as a fact through the flows and processes of production, technology, communication, and we see the process of globalization as an ideology, as a policy, and we do see the efforts by the IMF, the World Bank, working towards that ideology. And so we are going to look at a little bit of both globalization as fact, how it has impacted, or how it continues to impact several of these interconnectedness in terms of gender. And we will also look at part of the policies around globalization, and here is where we will look at a little bit about the international relations policies. So we see that the fact that globalization is a network of these systems and processes has some repercussions, quite significant repercussions. And globalization as a systematic connectedness, it reflects the relentless and ongoing growth of the world system. So if you can imagine the world system, and it comes from neoclassical economics, that the growth and the development, the ongoing growth of world systems is reflected in the systematic interconnectedness that is brought forward with an understanding of globalization. The second understanding, or the second repercussion that brings to focus, is the gap between the rich and the poor has widened both within and between nations. So the gap, the economic gap, and in this respect, we are also going to talk about the gender gap. So the gap between the rich and the poor has widened, between the nations, and there's a whole different argument in with regard to the globalization of risk, which means ecological risks have multiplied, and this ties in with the globalization discourse with the environment and ecology, that with the growth of globalization, the ecological risks have multiplied. So again, give Friedman a read, The World is Flat, and where you will be able to see how the 10 flatteners actually came in to facilitate the range of interconnectedness, systematic connectedness that we see and understand currently with regard to globalization. So globalization, we have seen affects climate change, and in the previous lecture you have seen how several of the coastal communities anticipate increased flooding or more severe storm surges, and we have seen the case of Maheshwari from the documentary that I talked about in Gender and the Environment, that how she has developed herself as a resource person who provides satellite information to fishermen who are out in the sea, and the satellite information on weather conditions help the fishermen who are out in the sea to take informed decisions and not be trapped in a natural calamity. So these are very subtle ways where gender actually percolates into the understanding, into the globalization discourse, and this is one case where we see how gender actually operates. Another quite significant impact that globalization makes is in the making and remaking of culture. So if we can imagine again as a system of flows and processes using the sociological angle, we see that people assign meanings and value to texts, messages and products they receive. And this goes back to the sociological understanding of how a society functions on the basis of a shared set of assumptions, a shared set of understanding. And we see that when forces from world centers enter into societies, they are indigenized. That is, they are modified to fit the local culture, which produces a world system of images. And Times actually did a cover story, almost more than 10 years ago, actually, that the emergence of the outsourcing process, and how that impacted several countries of the world, including India. And what are some of the images that are coming out, what are some of the symbolic understanding of that flow and processes, and the process of outsourcing is something that Friedman also talks about, is that they are producing indigenous versions of these connectedness. So, and these indigenous versions actually give rise to, or they inform, or they produce a world system of images, which then produces the understanding of remaking cultures. So this is another way that globalization's repercussion can be felt. So, we see that there is a rise in global system of images, and electronic mass media can spread and even help create national and ethnic identities. And we do see that so much of conversation, so much of debate, so much of reflections go on regarding the electronic mass media, and how that oftentimes help create or recreate many of the identities that we talk about, including identities of that concerns gender. Mass media also play an important role in this regard in maintaining ethnic and national identities among people who lead transnational lives. And we have seen that with an increasing rate of transnational living at the current time, where more and more people, families, groups, they are living across boundaries, across borders, national borders, yet they continue to maintain ties with their family members back home, and that the process of interconnectedness is facilitated by mass media. And we have cases, numerous cases where family relations are actually carried on over or through social media, through mass media, through facilities such as voice over the internet protocols such as Skype, etc. So you see the role of technology is at the center of influencing this global system of connectedness, and this in turn produces new forms of images, new forms of patterns, for example in this case, new forms of family patterns, transnational families, new forms of gender roles or relations within transnational families. So the influence of media, mass media, is huge in this respect. And we do see that nation states oftentimes willingly open to global culture of consumption. So we see that the global pattern or the global culture of consumption has changed over the past years, and it is continuing to change. And we do see that there is more and more exchange between nation states in this regard, and how there are significant similarities, yet there are differences in this global consumption pattern. So as I say, that globalization, has been um, a historical fact as much as it is, a contemporary fact. And there are, a few ideologies, a few theoretical ideologies that guide, how we understand globalization through the various paradigms. As paradigms shift, how do we understand the changing ideas of globalization? And so, globalization is really, an idea in motion. So it has never been static as much as it is imagined to be. And the idea of globalization being in motion can be looked through, three lenses in this regard, starting with the lens of postmodernity, which offers a condition of a world in flux with people on the move. So that is, one of the basic premises of postmodernity, in which established groups, boundaries, identities, contrasts, and standards are reaching out and breaking down. So we see that not just a world, of in flux, but also, people on the move. And we see several of these boundary ruptures of, identities, of groups, of contrasts, and standards. The idea of the postmodern in this respect, in its most general sense, describes the blurring and breakdown of established canons, such as rules, standards, and categories, distinctions, and boundaries. So, referring to the idea of the post, modern is more the idea of the boundary ruptures. And the third is the idea of postmodernism, which is a style and a movement in architecture that followed modernism. So, if you are familiar with the paradigms of modernism and postmodernism, one of the major indicators of understanding, these transitions from, one paradigm to the next, is one of the tangible indicators is architecture. So you can look at a particular architecture, and if you're familiar with the architectural patterns and characteristic features of architecture of a given time, you can look at an architecture and guess or probably analyze in what historical time period or context was it probably built. So, architecture offers one of the first visible, tangible ways for us to appreciate, the paradigm shift. So, compared with modernism, postmodern architecture is less geometric, less functional, less austere, more playful, and more willing to include elements from diverse times and cultures. So you see that these shifts, when it intersects with globalization, it comes with them, some indicators, whether it's tangible, such as architecture, or intangible, such as rupturing of boundaries, of norms, of identities. So it comes with it, these indicators, and this is important for us to understand, particularly when we are talking about, how gender roles or identities are changing, with respect to globalization. So one consistent idea that we have continued to see in scholarship that talks about gender and globalization is the idea of gender inequality. So how is inequality measured in this respect? Historically, we have seen that inequality has been measured through wealth and income, and we have seen expressions of inequality in economic terms when we use descriptors such as first, second, and third worlds. So historically, we see that wealth and income have been used to measure, inequality in terms of global scale. And we do see that these economic factors depend on the gross national product, the gross domestic product, measure the quality of life, or the HDI, or the Human Development Index. So more and more, as our understanding of the global gender order is refined, we find newer ways, we find more appropriate ways to understand how can we measure and understand the existence of a global gender gap, and how can we move towards reducing and eliminating that gender gap. So as you can see in this map on which titles the global gender gap. So as you can see on this map titled the global gender gap, so this map shows if you can see clearly, the darker areas have a very low gender gap, and the lighter areas, they have a very high figure of gender gap. So the Nordic countries, as you can see, they have they are reaching a point where they are closing the global gender gap, so they are reducing and probably eliminating it soon. But then we have countries across the world which are far from reducing the global gender gap, and the global gender the gap report actually talks about where each of these countries are. So there are 144 countries that are benchmarked, and the global gender gap report actually tells you in more details the status of each country in this respect. So the two maps that you see on the right talks about another aspect of gender equality, and the top one, does the Constitution take any approach to gender equality? And this is from the World Policy Analysis Center, both the maps. So the first map, the top map, you see that many of the countries which are colored in blue, including India, it is the Constitution guarantees gender equality. So there is a guarantee that we have a society crafted on principles of gender equality. But we do have countries, there is no constitutional guarantee, but we do see that those countries are taking special measures to close down the gender gap. Now if we see the bottom map and ask a different question, that does the Constitution guarantee protection from discrimination at work for women? And majority of the countries that you see on this map are red in color, which says that there are no relevant provision for guaranteeing protection from discrimination at work for women. Again, there are countries who are red in both these maps. However, they have some of these countries have moved towards a betterment of closing down the gender gap, and then in some countries in the second map, you see that there are some countries where it is guaranteed to women about protection from discrimination at work, and there are countries where there are kind of narrow guarantees. Now in this respect, in the past 5 or 6 years, we have seen important legislations that have come up, particularly in the Indian context, which addresses this fact, and there are important acts like the Sexual Harassment of Women at Work Prevention, Prohibition and Redressal Act of 2013, which is important in this regard. So with that, let us now look at some of the international policies coming from the theories of international relations that talk about how gender as a concept plays out in international policies. And scholars like Tickner and Joberg talk about, is that gender is not just about women, but also about the way international policies are framed, studied, and implemented. So, it is. So what they are saying is, it's not just about the categories of women and men, but it is also an ideological policy implication in the way that international policies are framed, international policies are studied, and international policies are implemented. And they also point out that conventional international relations relies on generalized rationalist explanations of asocial states' behavior in an anarchic international system. And the feminist theories that focus on international relations look at these social relations, particularly gender relations, rather than the anarchy, and they see an international system constituted by socially constructed gender hierarchies which contribute to gender subordination. So what they found very, very important is that not only are these gender hierarchies present, but these are socially constructed, and because these are socially constructed and they contribute to gender subordination at the global level, therefore we see a distorted view of gender arrangements in many of these global politics. So this is what the feminist theories from international relations call out for, is to look particularly for gender relations, gender experiences, rather than looking for anarchy, if you're interested in looking for the role of gender in globalization. Then they talk about the feminist theorizing in this respect emerged around the 1980s, in that global context, and the end of the Cold War and the re-evaluation of traditional IR theory during the 1990s, it opened up a space for gendering international relations. So you see, the context is coming from a particular geopolitical order, in this case the Cold War, and most of these feminist scholarships have sought to problematize the politics of knowledge construction within the discipline. And this is important because this is something that we have talked about before. How is the idea of knowledge production and construction taking place? That there are ways in which knowledge is constructed, and there are ways in which we understand how that knowledge is constructed, and the politics that goes behind this knowledge construction and production. This is where the feminist theorists from the IR background look at, focus on, and often adopting methodologies of deconstructivism associated with postmodernism. So the idea that we just looked at, that what does postmodernism do, how do we understand a paradigm shift, and this is exactly what they're trying to do, is to deconstruct some of these methodologies into a new way of methodologies. And then the feminist IR theorists also look at how international politics affects and is affected by both women and men, and also at how the core concepts that they are employed within the discipline of international relations are themselves gendered. So it just translates not just as a as a global social problem, but also within the discipline of IR, within academia, or people who study war, security, etc. Much of that knowledge production comes out as gendered. And the feminist IR theorists, they have not only concerned itself with the traditional focus of IR on states, war and diplomacy, but have also talked about the importance of looking at how gender shapes the current geopolitical economy or the global political economy. So, you see that we cannot overlook the fact that the production or the construction, the social construction of these gender hierarchies are based on certain assumptions that we have seen in the past few lectures. And because of these hierarchies, and because several people are placed at various places in this hierarchy, the shaping of policies, the shaping of many of these networks and processes at the global political level becomes gendered. So the feminist, the theorists from the IR, they question that where are the women, that why is it a fact that we do not see as many women in international politics or international relations as it should be, and they provide certain explanations, certain theoretical understanding for that. And one of the explanations that they provide for is that women are ignored by mainstream IR research, and their lives and experiences are excluded in thinking and theorizing an IR. So what they call is that current research on international relations represent only the mainstream view. As a consequence, it emerged as a gendered stream of knowledge production. And many of these writers, they argue that many only as thinking of IR only as high politics of war, of security, ignores the degree to which this is reflected in the intervention of women. So sometimes the discussions in IR involve only, or most of the time it involves the high politics, how we understand war, national security, etc. And though being significant, they tend to overlook oftentimes how the experiences of women and men play out at the social level, at the socio-cultural level. And so ignoring that moves away or keeps shadowed a part of this story which is not fully explored. So the IR theory, the feminist lens in IR theory, explore the idea of the masculine logic, where they bring in the understanding that we have seen in the previous lecture about the division between the public and the private. So the feminist IR theorists argue that gender relations they have not been fully explored in that field, and that is what makes that scholarship, that knowledge production gendered. And the ideas are not neutral, not gender neutral, but are reflected in the key concepts of power, sovereignty, anarchy, and security. So in this respect, what they find is that the knowledge production within the public sphere showcases the male experience, and the experiences of women have been historically located within the private sphere. So what we have talked about previously about the divisions and the existence of this sphere also gets translated in understanding the gender parameters in how the international politics play out in the global level. So the ideas here in the international policies level is based on certain gender specific assumptions, and these assumptions are often guided by the patriarchal norms, and we see that the conversation around the idea of the private and the public just brings forth with it a requirement to transcend those two spheres, to to conceive the domestic and the international as interdependent, as interconnected, and that is probably one of the starting points to see or the road towards achieving a more gender neutral type of explanation. And then much of these global policies, international policies that come from the IR background talk about certain assumptions, certain concepts, that the legitimacy of war is based on the cultural construction that men are supposed to fight wars to protect vulnerable people. So again, this is a key concept that revolves in gender and IR theory, and only a certain category of people are expected to fight for a certain category of people who are deemed vulnerable. There's a question of economic insecurity in which the category of women are disproportionately represented in this socioeconomic category, and this also translates to a disproportionate poverty as experienced by women in this respect. So according to an UNFPA source of 2008, we see that 60% of the world's people live in extreme poverty are women and girls. In this bar diagram, you can see the poverty rates for adults by gender and age as of 2010. For all of the three age groups that you can see, 18 to 4, 65 plus and 65 plus living alone, for all the three categories, we see a higher percentage of women recording poverty rates than men. So it is a global concern that when we calculate poverty figures, then why do we see that disproportionately a particular category of the society is represented in that category? So according to a study by Oxfam in 2007, we see that 66% of the world's working hours are worked by women, and in these two bar charts that you see, the top one that gives you an idea that how much time is spent by women on unpaid work. So this is the debate between formal and informal labor. So the first bar shows this is the OECD report of 2014 that a disproportionately higher amount of time is spent by women in doing unpaid work, since that becomes a parameter to understand the economic realities of paid and unpaid labor, particularly in areas like South Asia, in the Middle East, North Africa, in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, in Latin America. You see that it's pretty much everywhere across the regions depicted on this map. Women register a much higher time of doing unpaid work than men. And in the graph below that, where it is shown how much paid work do women do across these some of these areas of the world, we see that the labor force participation rate for male, which is 15 to 64, is the the black bar, and the red bar is the labor force participation rate for females, 15 to 64, and this is the World Bank data, that women do less paid work than men, that is the formal labor force, in all of the regions that you see in this map, whether it's South Asia, Middle East, North Africa, Europe, Central Asia, Latin America, or East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. So, you see that this is a global pattern, this is a global trend, that when we talk in terms of the impact of globalization, the impact of talking about these spheres, so talking about formal and informal labor, that we see a consistent global pattern, and therefore there has to be reasons, at the back of it, that why do we see consistent, similar patterns across the globe with regard to that. Similar studies were actually done to show what percentage of property worldwide is owned by women, and the answer to that is only 1%. In the two maps that you see, the top one shows the property rights in law and practice for women, and the second map shows the practice of property rights for women. So, as you can see that the areas that are red in both the maps, they need some attention, or a lot of attention, in terms of addressing the practice of property rights, or as property rights is guaranteed by law in these two countries, in these two maps. Then from another study, the Social Watch Gender Equity Index of 2008, we see that only 17% of parliamentary seats worldwide are held by women, and in the bar graph produced by the World Economic Forum in 2014, you see that the maximum in this regard is 26.6% in the Americas, and then it falls, and in Asia it's 18.3%, and it falls even more below that, the Arab states 16% and 15.4% for the Pacific region. Then Oxfam did a study on what percent of the total number of adults are illiterate adults as women, and the answer to that is 75%. And on this graph you can see the literacy rate by age in India as of 2011, where you see a distinct gender disparity in terms of the male and the female literacy rate as of the Indian census 2011. So this all translates into the influence, the impact of social reality on processes of globalization, and vice versa. So from the same study, actually Oxfam 2007, you see that only 33% of women worldwide are homeless or live in inadequate dwellings, such as slums. So this also points to the fact that when we talk of economic categories, the poor categories, the economically disadvantaged categories, disproportionately registers women as as that indicator of that category. So the Global Gender Gap report points out that as of 2017, what is the distance from gender parity by region? And this is the Global Gender Gap report of 2017 would be able to give you in greater details, and they have very nice documentaries and very nice short presentations that walk you through each of these regions. So please take a look at it when you can. So as of 2017, you can see in this display that Western Europe is at 75%, North America 72%, Eastern Europe, Central Asia at 71%, Latin America, Caribbean 70%, East Asia Pacific at 68%, the global weighted average is at 68%, Sub-Saharan Africa 68%, South Asia 66%, and Middle East and North Africa at 60. So, and what they have shown in the Global Gender Gap report is that eliminating the employment gap between men and women could boost the GDP around the world. So, if the gender gap of the regions can be done away with, can be eliminated, then there would be new understandings of the economic reality of the world. And this in a way is what the IR theorists also call in for, is a transcendence, is a blurring of the boundaries of the the private and the public, not using the strict, the rigid gender boundaries to understand the two spheres, but can we move towards an understanding that there's a boundary transgression. So when the public transgresses into the private and the private transgresses into the public. So, please take a look at the Global Gender Gap report of 2017. It is available for public viewing, and it just gives you a much holistic, much detailed idea of how much each of these benchmarked countries have traveled in terms of attaining attaining the gender question and eliminating the gender gap, and the projected path of each of these countries as outlined by the report. So, I want to leave you here with a question or a couple of questions to reflect on. That once you have taken a look at the Global Gender Gap report, reflect, what does the global gender gap indicate? That why or what are some of the key actions that can be taken to minimize or eliminate the gender gap nationally? So, when you think of the global gender gap, what does it indicate? Also, reflect back and think, what are the socio-cultural, practices, norms, values that influence or that inform the existence of a gender gap in society, or at the global level. So, that is, answering what does the global gender gap indicate, and what are some of the key actions that can be taken to minimize this gap nationally and internationally. If you're interested to read more, please look up Sarkar and Srivastav's Globalization and Gender. And in the next lecture, I will take up the cases of research methods in gender studies, starting with the quantitative research methods. Thank you.